Very much. So let me introduce Pastor Macy to you this morning. Would you give her a hand?
Good morning. Well, I am so excited to be here this morning. Yes, because I'm preaching, but mostly just because there's people in the room, and I've been alone for like 2 weeks. So I have a lot of words for you this morning. I've been home. I'm a substitute teacher, so school has been canceled, and my life was canceled. So I've been home, and I'm glad to be in church this morning, glad to see the Spirit moving. It's always just so refreshing to be in church. So I'm glad to be here, but I'm also really excited to be speaking specifically from the book of Ruth, because when Pastor Brent asked me to speak during our Ruth series, I got super pumped because this is actually one of my favorite books of the Bible. And it was not until I took a class on it in college. And that's because all throughout my life, I had heard, like Brent said, I had heard the story of the book of Ruth. And a lot of times it had been presented to me as kind of this unlikely romance between this damsel in distress, Ruth. She's in this terrible situation, and this handsome, wealthy man, Boaz, sweeps in and saves the day. And so that's kind of always what I thought the book of Ruth was about until I took a class in college. And of course, my professor wrecked my life. You know, it was a really hard class, actually. But what she taught me is that this book actually has a lot more to say than just a romance story. It's a lot more than just a story about a girl and a boy. This is a story about God. It's a story about faithfulness. And it's a story about how a faithful woman is faithful to God and how he's faithful back to her. And so I'm excited this morning to talk to you guys about what faithfulness means, what faithfulness meant in the life of Ruth, and what it means in your life. Because I think actually that a lot of us are looking for romance in our lives as well. We tend to see our stories as romance stories. And what I mean by that is not necessarily that your love story, you're looking for a love story. That's not really what I mean. Romance is actually broader than that. Romance is defined as a mystical event or moment in someone's life. And so a lot of times I think in the areas especially of our lives where we feel dissatisfied, we think it's going to be solved by romance, by some mystical, magical event or moment, by someone or something or some job or some situation sweeping in and saving the day. But what I think is actually true is that just like Ruth's story is not a romance but a story of faithfulness, our lives are not stories of big moments. They're stories of faithfulness. And when we miss that, we miss out on what God can do in our lives. Because faithfulness is a doorway. And we're going to learn today about what faithfulness brings to our lives. And if you get nothing else today, this is what I want you to see. In the life of Ruth and in your life, it's not romance that you need. You may think you need romance, but what you need is faithfulness. What you need is faithfulness. Marriages may start with romance, but many of you know better than I do that they're held together by day-to-day faithfulness. Families may have big, beautiful, romantic moments, maybe the birth of a new baby, a family dedication like we just had. Those are important moments. But a family is held together by faithfulness, by day after day communication and faithfulness. Our lives are not stories of romance. They're stories of faithfulness. And what I want you to know, what I want you to get from Ruth's story is that faithfulness is not just an end in itself. Faithfulness is a doorway. It leads us to something. And the thing that faithfulness leads us to is fruitfulness. I want you to remember that. Faithfulness brings fruitfulness. Faithfulness is the way to fruitfulness in your life. And we're going to learn that in the book of Ruth. And before we jump in to chapter 2, where we're going to be today, in chapter 2, we see the results of Ruth's faithfulness. But first, I want us to just review and look back at what that faithfulness actually is. So let's go for a moment to Ruth chapter 1. You'll remember from Pastor Brent's sermon And if you don't, I'm going to remind you. But in Pastor Brent's sermon, he told us this big story about this guy named Elimelech. And Elimelech is living in Bethlehem, and there's a famine in his land. So he moves to the pagan land of Moab. So he's an Israelite man. He's a man of God. He follows God. He moves to a place where people don't follow God. And in that place, he starts not following God. He makes some really bad decisions. He, first of all, marries his sons. He has 2 sons, and he marries them to 2 Moabite women, 2 women who didn't follow God. And that was a sin. That was an act of unfaithfulness. And we see in Elimelech's life how his unfaithfulness has results. And actually, that result is his death and the death of his 2 sons. So his wife Naomi is left in a foreign land without her children, without her husband. She now has these 2 daughters-in-law who should not have been brought into her family. She's hopeless. These women are hopeless in the beginning of chapter 1. And what we see is that Naomi decides, I'm going to go back to Bethlehem. I'm going to go back to the land of God and try to make this right. And she tells her daughters-in-law, you should just stay here. She tells them, it's hopeless for you to come with me because there's really no future for you with me. I can't have any children. I don't have any children. I can't get a husband. If I did get a husband, I couldn't have a baby. If I did have a baby, you'd be too old to marry it. So it's just not going to work. You should stay here. You should cut your losses and go home. And we see that one daughter-in-law does what she says, goes back to her family, but then we see Ruth emerge as this character, the picture of faithfulness. I want you to look with me at Ruth chapter 1, verse 16. But Ruth said, do not urge me to leave you or to return from following you. For where you go, I will go, and where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord do so to me, and more also, if anything but death parts me from you. And Naomi saw that she was determined, sounds pretty determined to me, to go with her, and so she said no more. So Ruth emerges as a picture in this story of unfaithfulness turning into death and destruction. Ruth emerges as a picture of faithfulness. We see her come onto the scene, and she's saying, I know the circumstances. I know that there are other things that might work out better in my life, but I also know the right thing. And the right thing is to be faithful. And so she refuses to go back to her family. She decides to be faithful with her mother-in-law, to stay with her, even to the point of denouncing her own family, saying, I'm not going to be one of my people anymore. I'm going to be one of your people. She denounces her own gods. I'm not going to follow my gods anymore. I'm going to follow your God, which is the God. And even if it kills me, I'm going to stay by you. And if I don't, if I break my promise, then God can kill me. That is faithfulness. That's the picture that's emerging. And I want you to know that these words we hear Ruth speak, a lot of times some of us are scarred by empty words. We've heard people make promises and then they don't keep them. These are not empty words. In the rest of the story, Ruth lives out this commitment. She truly is faithful to her mother-in-law. So that's the faithfulness we're talking about when we talk about Ruth being a faithful woman. But in chapter 2, we get to see the fruit of that. We get to see what actually comes from her faithfulness. And so faithfulness brings fruitfulness. I want you to get that today, that faithfulness brings fruitfulness. And this is not just in the story of Ruth's life. We're using her story as kind of a template, but this actually applies to our lives as well. Each and every one of us. Faithfulness in your life, just like in Ruth's, brings fruitfulness. We're going to look at 4 different kinds of fruitfulness that Ruth's faithfulness brings to her. And the first one is that her faithfulness, your faithfulness, brings favor. look with me at chapter 2, verse 1. Now Naomi had a relative of her husband's, a worthy man of the clan of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. Now, note in your head that Ruth doesn't know that. We know that. So Ruth doesn't know about Boaz. She doesn't know he's a relative and he's in the land, but we know. The author told us. And Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, "Let me go to the field and glean among the ears of grain after him, in whose sight I shall find favor." And she said to her, "Go, my daughter." So she set out and went and gleaned in the field after the reapers. And she happened to come to the part of the field belonging to Boaz, who was of the clan of Elimelech. So what's going on here is, remember, the ladies are hopeless. When they travel back to Bethlehem, they have no food, no way to get food, no way to make a future and a life for themselves. They're basically just shooting for it. We're just going to go back to Bethlehem and see what happens. But there was actually a law in Bethlehem at that time that allowed for people like these women, widows, orphans, people without a way, to get food. And so the people were supposed to leave extra food in the field that they didn't take with the rest of their harvest so that those type of people could come and get food. But what we know, because like Pastor Brent said, this is happening in a time when not very many people are following God. It's actually going to be really challenging for these women to find a field with someone who will have favor on them. And so that's why Ruth says, let me go and try to find favor in somebody's field. Let me go try to find a godly person who will actually follow the law and allow me to get some food. This is a dangerous task because it's very likely that somebody could have killed them, enslaved them, if they had not found favor. And so she's saying, let me go try to find a field because we're desperate. We're starving. I have to get food. And this is the only way. Let me try. And so Naomi lets her go and try. And what we see is that the text tells us she happened into this field of Boaz, their relative. And like I said, Ruth doesn't know Boaz is a relative. And what I see here is Ruth goes looking for one kind of favor. She goes looking for the favor of a man who owns a field. But what actually happens is that she finds two kinds of favor. And the first one is the favor of God. Faithfulness brings the favor of God. That phrase that says she happened into the field is actually a sarcastic phrase in this language. So it's not that they're literally saying, she just wandered into this field. They're saying something's going on behind the scenes. And we know that Ruth doesn't know this guy is a relative. And so what the author is telling us is that God is at play behind the scenes. She just so happened into the right field of a good man who's a relative of theirs without knowing, because God led her there. Faithfulness brings the favor of God. If you're hungry, if you're desperate, a lot of times we don't know where to turn. If you knew how to get food, you'd get it, right? If you knew how to get a better job, you'd do it. If you knew how to get more money, you'd do it. If you knew how to make your relationship with your wife better, you'd do it, but you don't know how. You need the favor of God. God knew that Boaz was a relative. God knew where his field was, and she just so happened into that place by the favor of God. Faithfulness brings the favor of God, and the favor of God is a doorway. The favor of God pushes us into places we couldn't ask to go, that we wouldn't know to ask to go. If you're desperate, you're hungry, you need some favor, it's the favor of God that you need. And faithfulness is the way to the favor of God. But Ruth didn't just need the favor of God in this situation. She actually needed a person to allow her to get food from their field. So there's a second kind of favor that we see playing out in the life of Ruth, and that's this. Faithfulness brings the favor of godly people. Look with me at Ruth 2:4-13. Gotta find it. And behold, Boaz came from Bethlehem, and he said to the reapers, "The Lord be with you." And they answered, "The Lord bless you." And then Boaz said to his young man who was in charge of the reapers, "Whose young woman is this?" He sees Ruth in the field. "Who's that chick? Whose woman is this?" And the servant who was in charge of the reapers answered, "She is the young Moabite woman who came back with Naomi from the country of Moab. She said, 'Please let me glean and gather among the sheaves after the reapers.' So she came, and she has continued from early morning until now, except for a short break." Then Boaz said to Ruth, "Now listen, my daughter. Do not go to glean in another field or leave this one, but keep close to my young women. Let your eyes be on the field that they are reaping, and go after them. Have I not charged the young men not to touch you? And when you are thirsty, go to the vessels and drink what the young men have drawn." Then Ruth fell on her face, bowing to the ground, and said to him, "Listen, why have I found favor in your eyes, that you should take notice of me, since I am a foreigner? Why would you have favor on me? I'm just a foreigner." But Boaz answered her, "All that you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband has been fully told to me, and how you left your father and your mother and your native land and came to a people that you did not know before. The Lord repay you for what you have done, and full reward be given to you by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge." Then she said, "I have found favor in your eyes, my Lord, for you have comforted me and spoken kindly to your servant, though I am not one of your servants." Faithfulness brings the favor of godly people. We know that Boaz is a godly man because he's following that law. He's allowing a widow to get food from his field, which means he follows the commandments of God, even when most people did not. He talks very kindly with his workers, revealing that he's a good boss, a good guy. And he talks about the Lord repeatedly in this conversation. So we know he's a good man. And we see that Ruth finds favor in his eyes, so much so that she falls to her knees and asks him, "Why? Why would you have favor on me?" Remember, she was desperate. She wanted favor so bad, but she knew it was a risk. She didn't know if it would happen. She falls on her knees. "Why have you had favor on me?" And the cool thing is, we don't have to guess why Boaz had favor on her. It could be because she was pretty. It could be because she was young and he wanted a wife. It could be because she was a foreigner and maybe he liked that. I don't know. No. He tells us, "Why have you found favor on me?" Because I know your story and because you've been faithful. They told me about how you stuck by your mother-in-law, even when it was hard and even when it didn't make sense, and how you came to this place you didn't know. And he even says, God should bless you for that. You've been faithful and you deserve God's blessing, so I'm going to bless you for that. And he gives her favor above and beyond what she deserved, even though she was a foreigner. He allows her to do more than she should have been able to do in this field. Faithfulness brings the favor of godly people. And just like the favor of God, the favor of godly people can lead us to places that we don't expect to go. Ruth was a foreigner. She should not have been allowed to glean in this field. But the favor of a godly man, opened up by her faithfulness, allowed a place for her to get what she needed, to do what she needed to do to provide for her family. If you're desperate and you're in a situation where you don't know how to change things, I don't have the money to buy my own field. I don't have the money to get this food. I've just got to go try and get it in somebody else's field. The favor of godly people will bring you things that you need. And the way to get that is through faithfulness. Faithfulness to God. Because the favor of God leads you to the favor of godly people. It plays together, guys. Faithfulness brings favor. The second kind of fruitfulness that we see coming in Ruth's life as a result of her faithfulness is fruit. And I know that is a little confusing because my overall point is that faithfulness brings fruitfulness, right? And what I mean when I say that is that faithfulness brings a big overall sense of abundance to your life. Faithfulness brings the things that you need. It opens doors. It brings God's favor. It brings abundance. But what I'm talking about right here when I say faithfulness brings fruit is that faithfulness brings actual physical fruit that meets the need in your life. Actual physical fruit. Let's look at verse 14. And at mealtime, Boaz said to her, "Come here and eat some bread and dip your morsel in the wine." So she sat beside the reapers, and they passed to her the roasted grain. And listen to this. She ate until she was satisfied. Remember, her greatest need at this time is food. She's been reaping in the field all morning, but she didn't eat that. That's like uncooked grain. She can't eat that. So at this point in the story, her need is met. She ate until she was satisfied. And she had some left over. When she rose to glean, Boaz instructed his young men, saying, "Let her glean even among the sheaves, and do not reproach her. And also pull out some from the bundles for her, and leave it for her to glean, and do not rebuke her." So she gleaned in the field until evening, and then she beat out what she had gleaned, and it was about an ephah of barley. Faithfulness brings actual physical fruit. Up until that morning, Ruth was starving. She had a real need in her life. She was starving. And through faithfulness, she's brought into the field by the favor of God. She's brought into the field of this man, Boaz. She finds favor in his eyes. And through that favor, through that faithfulness, she finds fruit. She finds food. She finds enough to sustain her, to satisfy her. And she had some left over, and it says that she had an ephah of barley. That's 29 to 50, which that's like a big gap, but that's what it is. 29 to 50 U.S. pounds of wheat. That's a 2-week supply for these two women. They were starving in the morning, and now she's a full belly with enough food for 2 weeks. Over and above what she needed, God provided for her through her faithfulness. If you are starving for something in your life, maybe it's food, maybe you need food, but maybe it's something else. Maybe you're starving in your relationships. You're saying, "I am lonely, I am lost, I need help." Maybe you're starving in your family, in your marriage, maybe in your finances. You're starving. If you need fruit in your life, faithfulness is the doorway to fruit. Faithfulness brings fruit. If you want fruit, you gotta get faithful. And I want you to look back with me at verse 7, where it says, "She came and she continued from early morning until now, except a short rest." Faithfulness and laziness do not coexist. You can't be faithful if you're lazy. You've got to get up and get faithful. If you're looking at an area of your life and you're saying, "This area is so barren," it's probably because you're not doing anything. It's probably because you're lazy. And I don't want to hurt your feelings with that, but it's just the truth. Don't expect fruit if you're not getting faithful. Faithfulness brings fruit. If you need fruit in your finances, get faithful. Are you tithing? Are you working? Maybe more than you think you should have to. You might have a season of time that you need to work more than 40 hours. Are you giving everything you've got? Are you looking? Are you getting faithful? Maybe you need fruit in your family relationships. You're saying, it feels like we're starving in this house. It feels like nobody knows each other. There's no connection. There's no love. Are you getting faithful? Are you praying? Are you investing? Are you giving time to your wife or your husband, to your children? Are you talking to them? Are you asking them questions even when they shut you down? Where's your faithfulness? If you want fruit, get faithful. Faithfulness brings fruit. The third kind of fruitfulness that we see coming forth in Ruth's life is that faithfulness brings faith. Faithfulness brings faith. In the beginning of this story, you'll remember that the ladies are totally hopeless. You could also say they're totally faithless. Naomi tells Ruth not to come with her. There's nothing for you. There's no hope. I have no faith that anything would work out. There's no way. No faith. But Ruth's faithfulness flips the script on that. I want you to look with me at verse 18. And she took it up and went into the city. Her mother-in-law saw what she had gleaned. She also brought out and gave her what food she had left over after being satisfied. And her mother-in-law said to her, "Where did you glean today? And where have you worked? Blessed be the man who took notice of you." So note there that Naomi doesn't know where Ruth has been all day. Ruth's been out gathering. She doesn't know where she's been. And Ruth doesn't know who Boaz is at this point. She doesn't know anything about him. We know he's a relative. She doesn't. So this is where that all comes together. So she told her mother-in-law with whom she had worked and said, "The man's name with whom I worked today is Boaz." And Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, "May he be blessed by the Lord, whose kindness has not forsaken the living or the dead." Naomi also said to her, "The man is a close relative. He's one of our redeemers." I want you to remember that word, one of our redeemers. And Ruth the Moabite said, "Besides, he said to me, 'You shall keep close by my young men until they have finished all my harvest.'" And Naomi said to Ruth, her daughter-in-law, "It is good, my daughter, that you go out with his young women, lest in another field you be assaulted." So she kept close to the young women of Boaz, gleaning until the end of the barley and wheat harvest. And she lived with her mother-in-law. So what we see going on here is a moment of hope. And in order to understand that, you've got to know what that term, one of our redeemers, means. When Ruth is told, when Naomi says to Ruth, "He's one of our redeemers," this is a moment of hope and faith sparking. And that's because this term redeemers is something that happened in their society to provide for people like these women who were widows with no children. You see, Ruth is young enough that she could remarry and have a son, have a family, and have a future. In their time, in order to be a woman with any kind of money or a future, you had to have a family. And so Ruth has the opportunity to get that, but Naomi is an old woman. There's no way she's going to find a husband, and there's certainly no way she's going to have a child. So they had an allowance for that. They had a way for that, and it's called a kinsman redeemer. That's what that word redeemer means. And it's a close relative who can marry a widow. And what happens is when that widow has her first child, it's like a symbolic child for the dead husband. And so through that method, a redeemer, Naomi can have a family because this close relative could provide a child for her deceased son. So she could have a family. So when they say, he's one of our redeemers, I like to think of it almost like a moment in a Hallmark movie. And remember, I'm not talking about romance. That's not what this story is about. But I think there's a similar thing going on in a lot of Hallmark movies. If you watch Hallmark movies, you know that a lot of times there's a girl who works in the big city at an accounting firm, okay? And she hates it, which I would hate it too, okay? Too many words for accounting for me, but I would also hate it. So she is working in this accounting firm. She hates it, and almost always there's a moment in the movie. She's sitting on her mom's couch, and she's crying about how much she hates the city. And in walks her old high school sweetheart. And he has a cowboy hat on. And you just know that he's going to solve everything. I'm not talking about romance. I'm talking about hope. We love those moments in a Hallmark movie because it's a moment where hope sparks. Where we say this girl who's miserable in her life might actually have a way to make things better. That's what happens when they realize that Boaz is a redeemer in their family. He can provide some hope for us. It's a moment where faith is sparking. They've been walking in faithfulness. We've seen Ruth walking in faithfulness. But I imagine that up until this point, it was kind of a drudgery for her. It wasn't very fun. Day in and day out, she's just trying to make it through. I know I should be faithful to my mother-in-law. I'm going to go try and get some wheat in this field. I'm going to go try and get some food for us. I'm not sure how things are going to get better, but I'm just going to keep going. That's the faithfulness until this point. But when faith sparks, things change. And instead of walking with a miserable faithfulness, she starts to walk in faith. This could actually get better. This guy, Boaz, is one of our redeemers. He could actually help us out. He could provide a child for us. He could provide a future for us. Things might get better. If you're living in desperation, like Ruth was living in desperation, you know that there's not a lot of faith there. It can be easy to just look at your situation and say, I don't know how this could ever get better. But let me tell you that faithfulness brings faith. If you need hope, if you need faith, get up and get faithful. Start walking in that day-to-day faithfulness. Start walking, doing what you're supposed to be doing, and I promise you there will come a moment where faith sparks. Things could actually get better here. My life could actually turn out okay. If you're hungry for something, if you're desperate for a little bit of faith, get faithful. Faithfulness brings faith. But what's awesome in this story is that faith moment, that faith spark moment is not empty. It leads to something. They don't just have a moment of hope and then it drifts away. They have hope and it leads to something. And that leads me to my fourth thing, my fourth type of fruitfulness that I see in the life of Ruth as a result of her faithfulness. That's faithfulness brings a future. Faithfulness brings a future. Now, I'm actually jumping ahead to the end of the book for this point, and that's not because I like to give spoilers and ruin a good story for you. I actually don't like to do that, but what I know about this book is that it's not just a fun story that's included in the Bible. It's included in the Bible for a reason, and that's because it's a genealogy story. Big word, but what that means is basically it's like a pre-birth story. It's the story of somebody's ancestors, somebody who's gonna become a big deal in the Bible. This tells us about their ancestors, how they came into the world. And so it's really important to know the end of the story so we can understand what's going on in the story. Look with me at chapter 4, verse 13. So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. And he went into her, and the Lord gave her conception, and she bore a son. She's been hopeless. No hope of a future. No faith for what's to come. But we see at the end of the story that she bears a son. She bears a future. Ruth's faithfulness leads her to her future. But what's so cool about this is that that future is not just for Ruth. Her faithfulness is bigger than that. Remember Naomi. She's hopeless too. How's she going to get a child? Boaz is their redeemer. This child is not just for Ruth. This is a child for Naomi. Naomi gets a future. Ruth's faithfulness brings a future not only to herself, but to her mother-in-law. Faithfulness brings a future not just to you, but to those around you. But guess what? It's actually better than that. Because the child that Ruth gives birth to is an ancestor of King David. And King David becomes the king of Israel. And he leads the Israelite people toward God. He's a good king. She gives birth to a son, and that son is a future to Israel. It's not just for her. It's not just for Naomi. It's for all of Israel. But guess what? It's actually better than that. Because King David is an ancestor of Jesus Christ. Ruth's faithfulness brings a future to her. It brings a future to Naomi. It brings a future to Israel. But it also brings a future to you and me. Without Ruth's faithfulness, we might not have Jesus Christ. The reason that we're here today, the reason that we worship. Her faithfulness brought a future, not only to her and those around her, but to all those to come and to all of creation. You might think faithfulness sounds boring, but it's not. It brings a future. And that future is not just about you. It brings a future to all those around you and all those to come. Your faithfulness has a future. It's not boring. Get that out of your head. Faithfulness is not just day-to-day monotony. It is life or death. You might be wondering, how am I supposed to remain faithful in my marriage? It's too hard. Maybe it's not just about you. Maybe you need to remain faithful in your marriage, not just because it's the right thing to do, but because your children and your children's children need you to. How am I supposed to remain faithful in my job? My boss is a jerk. I just want to spout off. I just want to send an email. I just want to get out of here. Maybe it's not just about you. Maybe your coworkers need you. Maybe their eternity is hinging on your faithfulness, on you walking out day to day looking like Jesus in front of them. It's not just about you. Your faithfulness is not just about you. And I want to tell you a story of how faithfulness brought me a future. A long time ago, there was a man who was out in a field working in a tractor. And that tractor turned over on him. And his legs were caught. And the tractor caught on fire. And this man prayed to God, God, if you'll let me out from under this burning tractor, I will be faithful to you. I'll raise my kids to know you. I'll teach my grandkids to know you. I'll be faithful if you'll just let me out of here. And God made a way for that man to come out of that tractor. And he was faithful. And he married a faithful woman. And they raised their kids to be faithful people. And their son married a faithful woman. And they had me. And they taught me how to be faithful. Without their faithfulness, I wouldn't be here proclaiming the gospel. Without their faithfulness, I wouldn't have the future that I have. I wouldn't get to teach my children about God. Your faithfulness has a future beyond what you can see. It's not just about you. It's about all those around you and all those to come. You've got to get faithful. I hope you hear my desperation in this. Faithfulness matters. Faithfulness matters. And faithfulness brings a future. Now, I want to talk to you for just a second. If you're sitting back and you're thinking, this all sounds really nice. Faithfulness sounds great. But this little lady in the flowy pants on the stage, she does not know my situation. If you just knew my situation, you would know I'm exempt. I don't have to be faithful. Let me tell you about a situation. Ruth is the most unlikely character in this story to become the picture of faithfulness. Let me just count the strikes against this girl. First of all, the very act that brings her into our story is an act of unfaithfulness and sin. She's only here because somebody was unfaithful. 2, she's a Moabite, which means she was raised in not a good little Christian home. Faithfulness wasn't modeled for her like it was modeled for me. Her parents probably taught her to do crazy, immoral things. They definitely taught her to serve pagan gods. Number 3, she was a woman, which meant that in her time, she could not have been standing up here talking to you. She had no voice, no authority. Who's going to listen to this girl? How could she change the world? 4, she was a foreigner, which meant people didn't like her. People didn't want to be her friend. Number 5, she was a widow, which meant she had no family to protect her, no one to provide for her, and the only family member she did have was also a widow. 6, she had no children. She had no hope, no future. Ruth was dishonorable, lowly, unimportant, unwanted, alone, and hopeless. That's a situation. But the good news for you today is that faithfulness is not a characteristic. Faithfulness is not a personality trait. It's not something taught to you by your mom and dad. Faithfulness is a choice. When faithfulness was placed before Ruth, she had a choice. I can either be faithful to my mother-in-law or I can walk away. You have a choice today, my friends. You have a choice to get up and get faithful in your situation, to walk in faithfulness, or to walk away. It's a choice. You have a choice. I want to ask you a question, and then I want to give you a promise. What are you longing for? Where are you starving? Where are you desperate? Is it your finances? Are you desperate? You need more than what you have. Is it your family? You're desperate for more connection with your children. Is it your marriage? Is it your job? Is it school? Is it your wellness and your health? Where are you desperate? Where do you need a touch from God? Maybe you're in the room today and you don't know God, and you're just feeling a calling to get faithful in the first step, just to start being faithful toward God. That's a longing in your whole life. I need something different. Where are you longing? Where are you desperate? Be honest. And then I have a promise for you. If you'll get up and get faithful, I promise that you'll begin to see the favor of God in your life, the favor of godly people in your life. You'll begin to see fruit in that place where you need it most. You'll begin to see faith sparking, and I promise you will have a future if you'll get up and get faithful. You've got to get faithful. And I want to tell you today that the first step toward faithfulness, the first way to get up and get faithful is to get down on your knees and pray. The first way you get faithful in your marriage is to pray for your spouse. The first way you get faithful in your family is to pray for your kids. The first way you get faithful in your school is to pray. The first way you get faithful in your job, pray. The first way you get faithful in your health, pray. If you're desperate, get faithful. And that starts right here in prayer.